Upload. Get yourself on the BBC with Leo Ulph on BBC Radio Kent.
Hello again, everybody. Thank you so much for being with me here on BBC Radio Kent Upload. A pleasure to do and hopefully a pleasure to listen to as well. 15 minutes to go. 15 minutes to go. We've still got two more to do. One song by Hattie Tuzan is coming up. Crazy. It's absolutely wonderful. We're going to take a little bit of a handbrake turn now and go for a little bit more insightful and thoughtful poetry. Now, this is from Thomas McColl. It is called The Greatest Poem. And it's about a poet planning to go to the Nayland Rock Shelter in Margate, exactly 100 years on from when T.S. Eliot went there to write The Wasteland, the best poem of the 20th century, in the hope that as a result he'll end up writing the best poem of the 21st century. But then he worries it might be a case of him inversely writing the worst poem of the 21st century, fearing the current conditions in terms of inspiration will make that quite likely. That is basically every time I go shopping. But this is The Greatest Poem by Thomas McColl on Upload.
The Greatest Poem by Thomas McColl. I've been thinking, if I visit the Nayland Rock Shelter overlooking Margate Sands at the right time in the autumn of 2021, exactly 100 years on from when Thomas Stearns Eliot went there to write his masterpiece, The Wasteland, the greatest poem of the 20th century, then if I sit there long enough with my laptop, maybe I'll end up writing the greatest poem of the 21st century. Things in my favour. My first name is Thomas. I once worked for Lloyds Bank and I write poetry. Things that might go against me. My surname isn't Eliot, it's McColl. Working for Lloyds Bank is in itself no indicator of literary talent, and history doesn't tend to repeat itself. In fact, what if this time round the inverse happens and I end up writing the worst poem of the 21st century? In the current climate it's highly likely. Let's face it, Thomas Stearns Eliot had advances in psychoanalysis to help him get in the right frame of mind, whereas all I have is advances in social media. Who knows, maybe by 2021 I'll have no choice but to fit my opus into 4 lines on Instagram. But then when I do, my simple artless platitude will inexplicably receive 1 million likes, and then released as part of a book will inexplicably sell 1 million copies, and my poem will be so bad that everyone will definitely remember it much more than whatever the best poem of the 21st century will actually be, written perhaps by someone who, like Eliot, may be going through difficult times, and talented enough to harness adversity, will out of that create a brilliant epic poem. But unfortunately, there'll no longer be anyone with the attention span to read it, let alone publish it, and he or she in despair will delete it and give up writing altogether. Whereas I'll go on to publish book after book, and William McGonagall will turn in his grave at no longer being the worst poet in the English language, usurped by Thomas McColl, now famous for having written the worst poem of the 21st century, or indeed any century. But that's the thing, writing the worst ever poem is no barrier anymore to immense success. Thomas Stearns Eliot may well have been the best, but there's no room for that now. Now it has to be 4 lines or less and totally trite. 1921, been and gone. 2021, bring it on.
The Greatest Poem by Thomas McColl. Interesting, it involved a lot with the Kent poetry scene, and the poem set in Margate being specifically written for an event she called Journeys with the Wasteland. That was put on in April 2018 by the landing place of the Turner Contemporary in Margate. Absolutely wonderful. He was invited by Angela Dye to read at the Faversham Fringe the following year. Absolutely brilliant stuff, that. Thomas McColl with The Greatest Poem.